So, Tom, we are in the midst of obviously, impeachment has been rolling out. This week, we have seen the public release of depositions that were taken in private over the past, I guess, month or so. Those private depositions were the source of much consternation, if we are to believe them, from Republican leaders, because these depositions, which were attended by both Republicans and Democrats, were done in private, which is fairly consistent with depositions being taken. And the Democrats are now sort of easing into the public stage of this of testimony to determine whether they will vote on impeachment and what those articles of impeachment have been. But you had a piece that is specifically about the Republican response. We've heard quite a bit over and over again, if in the context of a criminal trial, if you don't have the facts, argue the law. If you don't have the law, argue just for the sake of arguing. And there's like, I don't know, but it seems to be like 30 variants of that. But yours is, in this instance, it seems to me, it's if they don't have the facts, you can't argue the facts, you argue the law. If you can't argue the law, you start to argue whether our democracy is legitimate or not. And that starts getting into a problem, huh?
That's right. That's exactly right.
So, I mean, just expand on this and this concept of what you call regime cleavage.
Sure thing. So this rises in the context of the impeachment proceedings because of the common refrain, both from the president and some of his strongest supporters, that the impeachment proceedings are somehow illegitimate. And the implication being that he may have the right not to comply with them or not be bound by whatever the findings happen to be, or that he can legitimately order his subordinates or members of administration not to participate in them. This raises a question because we're seeing the politicization right now of the very structure of American politics, the very basic procedures of executive oversight by the legislature, which are enshrined in the Constitution. Now, whatever you feel about the Constitution and its weaknesses, and trust me, there are many, we do have a constitutional order in the United States and have hundreds of years of precedent that both parties, be they Democrats, Republicans, or different parties in earlier eras, agree to be subject to the rule of law as laid out in the Constitution. And the Constitution clearly specifies grounds for impeachment and a procedure for which that is done, and there is precisely nothing about the current proceedings that violate the Constitution that are somehow irregular or improper. Now, I raise this because the criticism of these proceedings implies a view among the president and his supporters that if the laws that we have written about how to investigate the president don't favor him, then he needs to overturn them. And this politicizes our rule of law in really unhealthy ways, and frankly, they're frightening ways. If the president alone determines when the rule of law applies and to whom it applies, then we should no longer understand ourselves as being bound by widely agreed constitutional procedures. And so the term regime cleavage is used to describe a situation in a country that is in which the main divide in politics is between not left and right, not between different ethnic groups, not between different religions or different views of public policy, but rather between the very question of whether or not the constitutional order ought to be protected or ought to be or if it may legitimately be abrogated. And that's what I fear we are seeing right now in the United States.
I mean, I can't help but remember what I saw earlier this week. Kevin McCarthy I guess it was last Sunday. It was on, I don't know if it was Face the Nation or one of those things. And he kept saying over and over again, this is an assault on our democracy, the impeachment hearings. And I was just I mean, I mean, that's exactly what you're talking about here, right? Where there is where it's one thing to say, like, this is an assault on the will of the voters, you could say, I guess, without like attacking.
It's an assault on the president. It is because that's what it is. It's an assault on one party, which has elected a president who appears to have explicitly asked for a quid pro quo, if you believe the most recent press releases from the House impeachment proceedings. But yeah, this is the way that these things tend to devolve is in the comparative context is that one side claims that it is protecting the rule of law by following the rule of law, and the other side then proposes that following the rule of law is itself undermining democracy. And so what Kevin McCarthy is articulating is the latter position. The only way to hit back, the only possible defense that he can offer is that it's somehow non-specifically illegitimate or undemocratic to investigate the president. And whether or not you're a proponent of a hard reading of the U.S. Constitution, an originalist interpretation, or a more living Constitution approach, there is no plausible, legally valid interpretation of the Constitution that says that there's anything improper about the way that this investigation has been unfolding. This is subject to the Senate's and the House's own rules, and they have been followed.
And so when he's saying this is an assault on democracy, what he's really saying is that our Constitution is an assault on democracy. And maybe there's an argument to that, right? But we all have to sort of, unless we change the Constitution, we all have to sort of subscribe to it.
That's right. And that's the sort of the core governing norm of any democracy is that whatever the rules are that are in place when the Constitution is written, or whatever the procedures that are outlined in that, one only changes them by formally going through the procedures of changing them. One does not appeal to the legitimacy or illegitimacy of the process with reference to the anticipated outcomes. Right. So I don't think that Kevin McCarthy quite understands what he's saying, and that the Constitution itself is an assault on American democracy. But that is the only implication to draw. And the worrying thought that I have is that, and that I tried to articulate in this essay, is that if large portions of the American electorate come to believe that the Constitution is the constraint on their view of how politics ought to be, then they will be tolerant of violating that Constitution. And it's hard to see how American democracy could recover from that level of distrust. You
outline for us what regime cleavage is. It is a cleave in society, not about different political parties or issues or even identity groups, but rather about a perception or really a mutuality in subscribing to a constitutional order. And in the I don't know if we're in the wake of impeachment, or at least the beginnings of the impeachment, we are starting to see Republicans defend the president by claiming that impeachment is on its face an anti-democratic instrument. And this is problematic, as you said, because this begins to, chip away at citizens' trust in the institutions that hold the country together. Go further for this. Walk us through this. I mean, when Kevin McCarthy, when Mitch McConnell come out there and say this impeachment is a sham, that or when the president says the emoluments clause is a fraud, and Kevin McCarthy says it's an attack on democracy, where does that, like, when people hear that, who are supporters of the president, what does that provide? What cues does that give them? Where does it lead?
Well, it's hard to say where concretely it leads, and I won't speak for every possible member of the Republican Party or supporter of the president. But what I can say is that language just has a way of diminishing people's belief that the members of the House that are running the impeachment inquiry or their co-partisans elsewhere in government or in society care about democracy. The argument being, if this is anti-democratic or this is an assault on our democracy, or if invoking the emolument clause is somehow illegitimate, then the people who are doing it are themselves not the defenders of democracy, or that they are somehow illegitimate, or that the things that they're asking for are inappropriate. And what this does is increasingly pits the two groups of Americans against each other, not over any concrete policy or any concrete even identity, but over whether or not we ought to hold the president in principle, not in practice, in principle, whether it's appropriate to hold him to account. And I'll make no secret that I don't find the U.S. Constitution to be the most progressive or inclusive or representative document of all time, but I plainly believe that it gives Congress the ability to investigate and hold the president to account. And I think that this is an objective reading, not just a partisan viewpoint.
How is Mitch McConnell refusing to hold hearings for Merrick Garland also not an example of this? Was it, how do you, A, and then B, how do you fight this? I mean, is there a way to fight it?
Well, this is tough. I won't speak so much to the specific instance of Mitch McConnell refusing to hold hearings for Merrick Garland. Suffice it to say that this is part of a probably decades-long process of increasingly serious legislative hardball, in which you have two competing views of accountability. One in which the legislature gets to stop the president from fulfilling his constitutional mandates whenever it can, and the other is that the president ought to be able to do whatever he wants, regardless of what the legislature says. And the surprising, or perhaps not surprising, if you study the comparative politics of Democratic decline, observation is that the same politician can be on both sides, depending on whether or not his co-partisan holds the presidency. So I think that one is not less bad, one is not more bad, but they're sort of two sides of the same coin, and part of a process of increasing polarization, which, not being a strong expert in American politics itself, I date probably to Newt Gingrich's time as Speaker.
Okay. All right. Well, so what do you, and I think that's true, and this has been ongoing. So how do you respond to this? I mean, not you personally, but I mean, how should society respond to this? We're sitting here, we're like almost like sitting by the side of the road and watching a car careen off the highway. I mean, what do we do?
Well, it's hard, and these processes are hard to unwind once they start, but. And the suggestions that I have for how these things tend to work, looking at analogous situations elsewhere in the world, are not likely to be popular. But the way that you do it is you convince members of the ruling party, in this case the party that controls the Senate, that they actually do care more about the constitutional order than they do about the fate of their president, and that it need not be a unanimous convincing, but it probably involves some compromise, and it may involve some indelegate politics, but a way to assure that the GOP senators who have who we all agree probably privately detest the president and his blatantly corrupt and ineffective government. It should be a simple matter to convince them to just publicly reveal that this is their position, and that they will. But the trick is to convince them that they will survive and they will thrive in a world after the president. Right? They do not need to lash themselves to the Trump train in order to have a future in politics. Now, this is difficult to do. It probably involves conceding things that the Democrats and their fellow travelers would support. But if the goal is to save the constitutional order, and you believe, as I increasingly worry, that we're facing a basic question over the legitimacy of the American Constitution, then what you do is you appeal to that Constitution in ways that
Give me an example of what you're talking about, because from my perspective, there's nothing that the Democrats can say to, I don't know, pick a person, Tom Cotton, I don't know, or a half, 90% of the Republican senators. I mean, I can see a half a dozen maybe because they're in purple states, but these are senators who are in deep red states, whose constituents love Donald Trump and are getting messaging not just from the Republican leadership, but also getting it from Fox News. What's a Democrat going to say to, one of these Republican senators, to Lindsey Graham, that's going to get him to care about the Constitution and as opposed to, what their voters want?
Well, you don't start with them. You start with the ones who are closer to the Democrats and who are more moderate and have a longer record of sensitivity to bipartisan concerns. And what you tell them, a deal of this form might be, it looks increasingly like the vice president himself may have been aware of some of these things. The agreement is we will not impeach the vice president. The vice president Pence can be the president. And we will not do an investigation of him. We will not impeach him for what may have been actual crimes, because the real objective is to get President Trump out of office.
And do you do this publicly?
Perhaps we will. I don't know. I'm not sure if this is a strategy. I'm not the.
You're just giving
I'm
an
not
example.
The political who knows who best to do this. But this, for example, is a way that you could do this. You may also take a lesson from the politics of ousting dictators. You may immediately announce that President Trump is pardoned for all of the crimes, federal and state, right? To the extent to which his state level investigations can be pardoned. You enforce that there is going to be no personal political costs or personal criminal costs that he has to pay. These are unsavory, unpopular deals. But
this is how you get
done
This is how you oust a dictator. You say we got a third country to send you to, and you get to keep all your money, and you can build a big mansion there. And
Marcos can go to Hawaii, and you do this by peeling off softliners. The way that the comparative politics thinks about this, you peel off the softliners, those who are willing to work for the good of the order instead of the good of the party. And you celebrate them. You say that they're heroes.
Tom Pepinsky, we're out of time, but it's a fascinating piece. People should check it out. It's also a little bit worrisome because I don't think we're going to be able to put an offer on the table that is going to satiate them. But we will see. Thanks so much for your time.